My name is ISMAIL Lodido Ali. I live in Oakland, California. Grew up in Fresno, California, in what they call the Bible Belt of California, the Central Valley, agricultural breadbasket of the world. And I've been thinking about crime and punishment and justice and love for a really long time. If you can't tell, this little kid right here with the Muslim shirt on, next to my brother and some of my really good friends, this is 2002, before we actually invaded Iraq, after we had already entered Afghanistan. And it was the very beginning of my socialization, political socialization, you might say. Disillusionment, the first crack in the facade that had brought my parents from Pakistan and from Colombia to California in the 1980s. And it was that young child and the version that emerged from that self that really began to understand the layers of systems that we were operating within. And I was going to tell one version of this story to give you an idea of who I am and what I'm doing here, which basically boils down to experiencing the disillusionment that came with being a young Muslim after 9/11 and experiencing that kind of shift in American policy and even seeing it in my own family's process. The mosque that I was going to being surveilled, seeing the civil liberties erode from under us, the Patriot Act, Guantanamo Bay. Disillusionment leading to a lot of angst, that angst leading to a lot of righteousness, that righteousness leading me to wear shirts like that and protest. And then when I was 14, having an experience that really made me wake up and realize I had to know what I was talking about if I was going to be claiming these things. I really had to spend the time and energy to do the research, to understand who I was and where I was coming from. And then that leading to my first experience with psilocybin at 16 and my angst turning to curiosity and everything changing because of that. But what I actually want to focus on a bit for this first piece is a slightly different story, which I didn't think I was going to tell. But after seeing Swoon's presentation, I feel really called to share. Being here feels really meaningful for me. It was the first conference I attended as a MAPS employee when I first started working in 2016. As a policy fellow, I had gotten a fellowship from Berkeley Law School to fund my first year at MAPS because it was public interest work. And I was able to take advantage of that and move in. And it was actually here on a walk to lunch that I met Bia for the first time in 2016. And I was coming out of the first experience I had had drinking ayahuasca with my family after the death of my mother, after she had been sick with cancer for 12 years, and after experiencing the deep family healing and the grief processing that can happen when you sit in a ceremony with your grandmother and your cousins and your aunts and your family. And experiencing that process unfold and really experiencing it firsthand. And I feel very honored because Bia, right after we met, actually invited me, heard that story and invited me to speak at the World Ayahuasca Conference, which was in Rio Branco like 3 weeks later or something. And I gave a talk about the public health implications, actually, of family healing dynamics, or healing family dynamics with plant medicine. And I just really appreciate Swoon and the story that they told because I feel like it really cuts to a lot of the core of what a lot of this gets to, which is like, what would it mean to be doing this work with our family? What would it mean to be doing this work with the people that we really care about the most, that we trust the most, that we wish the most healing for, and what that could possibly look like. It's really meaningful, and I really appreciate that. So it's with that kind of like energy that I come forward here, and through that process, through my first experience with mushrooms as a teenager, my experience with other medicines over time, kind of navigating this disillusionment, this angst, this curiosity, this growth, that led me to going to Berkeley Law School, graduating, focusing on human rights and criminal justice policy reform, and then ending up at MAPS and now working as policy counsel, focusing on legal policy strategy. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So this talk today is going to be a bit about a narrow-ish subject, but we'll get into a few different details of it. And it's going to focus on this whole theme of decriminalization. Just to give you an idea of the roadmap, this will be broken up into about 4 pieces. How did we get here? Why psychedelics? Why decriminalization? And what is there to look forward to? Because there's a lot going on, you might have noticed. One of the things that Horizons does so well is really offer a huge spectrum of people who are in this space that are doing this work. that are providing information. And you've seen, if you've been here all weekend, anything from like the most kind of like hard science, the data, the information that comes out of the research, to over time kind of how that is implicated in people's direct experience, whether it's through art or through family or through culture or through song. So the idea today is to focus on decriminalization and the challenges and opportunities that come with this new effort, these efforts that are emerging around changing laws around psychedelic use. But as you'll see, it implicates a little bit more than that. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a timeline just to get everyone situated, because 2019, and if you've been paying attention, things are really weird right now. It's really hard to tell what's real and what's not, and I stopped reading The Onion because it's just like, you don't really know what in the headlines are trying to say, something, it's just, there's a lot going on, and it's really hard to tell what's real and what's not. So I'm going to start by just giving a few kind of like historical pieces to situate us on the same page about what timeline we're talking about here. Before we're going into anything, if you're actually interested in the relationship between colonization and genocide and the war on drugs, I urge you to take a look at this article that I got to write with my colleague Justice Rivera. It's called Colonization Laid the Groundwork for the War on Drugs. Colonization Laid the Groundwork for the War on Drugs, and that's written on the Fix. We published it in April of last year. So I'm not going to go into too much of the history today because it's too deep, but just so you know, colonization laid the groundwork for the war on drugs. So, as you've heard a little bit of this weekend, from 5,000 years and likely older to today, plant medicine practices, entheogenic practices, mind manifesting, some people might call psychedelic practices, but are ultimately about earth-based, land-based technologies and wisdom-carrying traditions have been practiced in various forms for thousands of years all over the world on every continent. 500 years ago, there was a shift. We have all heard the term, I think it's God, gold, glory, the process of what led European colonizers and colonizers from other parts of the world to begin taking land, beginning what we now know as like the imperial process, the process of imperial domination, and creating the system that we now know today that we live under in various forms. And then coming to 50 years ago, we've got what was known for a long time as the war on drugs. I learned yesterday that the term war on drugs is not used by the government anymore, which makes sense because it's not a really great term. But the idea is just the modern understanding of drug law enforcement as we know when we talk about mass incarceration, when we talk about the Controlled Substances Act, all of that. So that started really around 1970 with the passing of the Controlled Substances Act, bless you, and kind of creating the scheme that we know of today that we call prohibition. There's a lot more background to that, but I'm not going to go into it. So I'm going to skip forward to the 1980s, but before actually talking a little bit about what's happened in the last 20, 30 years, I just want to acknowledge that I'm going to be talking a little bit about cannabis as a history, as an example of what's going on here, but a lot of things have been happening in drug policy that aren't just cannabis. So I just want to say that out loud because things like stringent access, anything involving dignity for people who use drugs, anything involving access to methadone, a lot of pieces that have shifted drug policy in the last few years, much of which was done by organizations like the Drug Policy Alliance, shout out to all you that are here, also have been happening concurrently and are relevant to this conversation, but I'm narrowing it for the sake of this talk. So in the 1980s and early 1990s, the fight for medical marijuana really started to heat up, and a lot of that was based on advocacy done by primarily HIV-positive gay men in California and other parts of the world that were really seeing the value that medical marijuana specifically could have for indications like AIDS and like things around the appetite and other effects. And that over time crystallized into California passing Prop 215 in 1996, which was the first time that there was a drug that was Schedule I that had any sort of admitting of any kind that it could be used in any sort of way that wasn't just like criminal. And an exception was created in California law to allow for limited use, although it was kind of a mess because it didn't really clarify how to distribute, didn't really clarify how to grow. So they spent the next 20 years or so, 1996 to today, expanding medical marijuana across the United States and acknowledging that there may be value of marijuana as a medical tool, and that kind of started to become more and more normalized. It was in this time, over the course of this time, that this kind of theory of change emerged, that legalization follows medicalization, that maybe if people see that there's medical value to something, that it's worth legalizing, that's worth pushing in other directions. And that really was borne out because as we see, and I think that there's data that shows that as people get to know others who experience marijuana, who experience benefits from it, their relationship to it as a social aspect or as a cultural thing also starts to change. And that kind of opened the door for people to actually have conversations about adult use and have conversations about use that wasn't just medical. So that's been happening for the last 20 years. In 2010, Michelle Alexander published The New Jim Crow. And that was one of the first mainstream pieces of literature that really brought the conversation about mass incarceration and the war on drugs into the front page. Like, of course, people had known about it for a long time. Of course, a lot of advocates had thought about it for a long time. But the publishing of The New Jim Crow really marked, I think, a new era in the mainstream understanding of mass incarceration. 1 year later, California, incarcerated people in California went on a hunger strike. And soon after that, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Plata that the California prisons were so overcrowded that it violated the Eighth Amendment, the right from cruel and unusual punishment, and ordered the state of California to start reducing the number of prisoners that were in prison. They were at 200% of capacity, just so you know. They were at 200% of capacity, and the Supreme Court requested that they drop it down to 137.5%. So we're actually still above capacity, and that has both to do with the number of prison beds and the number of people that are getting arrested, but again, that's its own rabbit hole, so I won't go too far into it. In 2014, Colorado, Washington, and Oregon passed adult use. Again, looking this arc from medicalization to legal access, adult use of cannabis, suddenly a thing. Same year, California passes Proposition 47, which is the beginning of this process of defining terms, which I think are going to be helpful for this conversation. And this term is decriminalization. Decriminalization. The idea is that, or in other words, also defelonization. The idea is that what Prop 47 did is take a lot of crimes that were either wobblers, either felonies or misdemeanors, or that were considered felonies, and then dropped them down to misdemeanors. So it wasn't quite decriminalization. It wasn't eliminating criminality. It was reducing it. And it wasn't quite legalization because the activities were still illegal, things like simple drug possession and other property crimes, but that did reduce penalties. Okay, that's a good sign. In 2016, 7 more states and DC passed adult use initiative or similar efforts for cannabis, once again. Shout out to Dr. Bronner's, actually, because they were major funders in a lot of the initiatives and actually were deeply involved in, I think, the 7 out of 8 that passed. So really, really grateful for their advocacy and their work. Really at the front level. That same year, Oregon, and then 2019, Colorado further depenalized Schedule 1 and 2 personal drug possession to misdemeanors in most cases. So, starts pretty intense. There's like the last 500 years when it comes to drug war enforcement has been pretty brutal. But these last few years, we're starting to see some slow change bit by bit, and that's a good sign, right? Wrong. We are in the darkest timeline. So here's what's going on right now. As we have gotten to kind of start to shift drug policy in a way that feels meaningful, that feels like we're actually starting to make some progress, some other stuff has been going on behind the scenes. And the reality is that it's not behind the scenes. Y'all saw that exercise that George Goldsmith did where you raise your hands if you knew someone that had experienced mental health suffering. That's just the reality for everyone now. There aren't really that many people who don't know someone who's had some sort of touch with either addiction or suicidality or some sort of what people are now calling deaths of despair, death or malaise that comes from isolation, that comes from these harms that can be tracked to more kind of social community breakdowns that are kind of odd because they're affecting our lifespan. They're affecting what has once been like an increasing lifespan over an extended period of time and decreasing it once again because of preventable deaths like cirrhosis, like heart disease related to eating, like suicide, like alcohol poisoning, like overdose. So we have this crisis of mental health, and one of the presenters from the earlier really went into this topic, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but we're in this, what people see as a crisis of mental health, which I think is also a crisis of access to mental health care, which we'll get to in a second, but it's really articulating itself both individually and at the social level. We're also dealing with grotesque income and wealth inequality, which is especially hurtful, I think, as we've become aware of, as was also mentioned in the presentation earlier, that a lot of the extraction and the access to that wealth has come from violence, the scaling of projects that has resulted in violence and exploitation of natural resources and people, including labor and human lives. And then finally, the ongoing commodification of basic rights, resources, and social goods. And this is particularly an issue in America, and particularly an issue when we talk about healthcare. When we talk about access to healthcare, because the conversation about access to healthcare in places like Europe, where you have universal healthcare, are a little bit different because they're dealing with different things, different paradigms. what do psychedelics have to do with all that? Now, for some of you, it's probably really obvious. You've been here all weekend. Maybe this isn't your first horizons. You're like, I know exactly how psychedelics fit into this whole equation. You do them, and then it's good. So it's unfortunately not that simple. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. But I will say that although I'll be talking about decrim, it is good to know that there's a reason that medicalization, that science, that research has been the primary driving force of what we now know as the psychedelic renaissance. Term I hate because it's Eurocentric, but a term that recognizes the fact that there's something coming back. There's like a remembering, we're re-acknowledging some sort of familiarity that we have with these practices, and it happens to be emerging right now through medicine. And that's really nice, partially because medicine comes with some really good protections, one of them being quality of care, oversight, accountability, et cetera. So this is time for a disclaimer. While MAPS does not endorse state or local initiatives at this time because our political advocacy work is focused on federal and international law, we have and will continue to provide strategic input and serve as a movement connector for state and local psychedelic initiatives. So if you're interested, you can also look up the considerations on the regulation and legalization for psychedelic substances. This is a document that we wrote and published over the summer, which has a lot of overviews of how we generally think philosophically about how we start doing this work, and how we as a movement and community start to build in our values into this change. So why decriminalization, or can you give me some examples? So one of the things I've heard a lot this weekend are like, what about these other models? Like, okay, medicine has all these downsides. What about like decentralized, community-led care organizations? What about like cooperatively owned stuff? What about this? What about that? Like, those are really good ideas, and they all pretty much either require like a really complicated, big like legal licensing scheme, or something like decriminalization and a little bit of extra support to work. So I'm going to very briefly go over 4 case studies that kind of fall into the category. So right now, when people think about decriminalization, they might be thinking about, well, what happened in Denver, or what happened in Oregon, or what's happening in Oakland, or what's happening in California. And I just want to really briefly go over some of these because I think it'll help frame exactly where we're at the time. So in both Denver and Colorado, resolutions or city ordinance, one by vote in Denver and then by vote of the city council in Oakland, deprioritize enforcement of criminal penalties for, in Denver, psilocybin, and in Oakland for all entheogenic plants. Super exciting, not the same thing as decriminalization. This is a little bit complicated because in some ways it's de facto criminalization in the sense that if it works, there's the potential that local law enforcement does not engage or does not overlap or does not kind of challenge the efforts or movements that are happening locally to kind of create access to that. Really exciting and a really important step, but perhaps mostly symbolic and definitely a sign for more communication and more things to come. So while the substances in question remain illegal, the initiatives instruct law enforcement to keep it as the lowest law enforcement priority, which, when coupled with dialogue with the actors that are involved, whether the law enforcement or city or state governments, means that you might have some sort of room that's protected to do something, not unlike what you saw in California with Prop 215. So the next step there is to start, in both cases, creating advisory boards, creating educational systems, creating access to kind of containers within which this conversation can actually be had. And I'm really especially excited about what's been happening in Oakland. I'm biased because I live there, but it's nice because there's actually been a constant ongoing dialogue between the advocates that have been working and the people who are actually involved in city government and law enforcement, which means that there's a really open conversation between where to go next, and that's a really, really good sign. In California, there's a ballot initiative that's currently collecting signatures. That's the same thing in Oregon. These are very, very different, though. What's happening in California is the only one of the 4 examples that I'm giving that actually decriminalizes fully, and that's actually the point of the language, and I really appreciate it because that actually fully removes criminalization from these 2 substances, psilocybin and psilocin, and creates a few other options. So for example, there's like an educational diversion program if you're caught under 18, but otherwise essentially creates an open space for what could become an industry, what could become community organizations, what could become collectives. It's kind of unclear. Specifically, what's interesting is that it's okay to distribute in personal possession amounts without profit, which is one of the things that early cannabis laws tried to do, which led to, in many ways, the creation of what we know as the collectives. And then in Oregon, it's something a little bit different in the sense where, first off, there's actually no decriminalization in Oregon, so the way the language is currently written, it actually just creates exemptions to the criminal law for licensed use, and there's licenses available for different kinds of levels of practice, for distribution, for services, et cetera. And I think that one big thing that to pay attention to is this concern around what happens when licensed actors can operate while continuing to criminalize people who are able to pick the mushroom. And that's a particularly kind of salient hypocrisy that people are really concerned about, that I think feels very kind of inherent and feels very clear, and especially coming out of the fight for cannabis and seeing how important home grow and access to the plant itself was, it feels really, really critical that if we're going to be spending the time and energy to decriminalize one drug at a time, which if we do at this rate will take a really, really long time, if we're going to be doing that, then we at the very, very least need to make sure that we're doing that in a way that allows for as much access in as many ways as possible. Otherwise, what's the point? We might as well just go with medicalization. Really good system, kind of narrow in impact. So what remains, or what do these all have in common? And I just want to note that there's two big things that I'll mention now that I won't be talking about today, and one is legal preemption, or federal preemption, which is a huge issue, which is the fact that if the federal government or the state government doesn't like the laws that are being changed at the state or local level, they can just enforce the law anyway because that's their right to do, and that's what they do. So the reality is that anything that happens prior to federal law changing is at risk, and as many of you have probably seen, cannabis law has taken a really, really, really long time to get to a point where it feels relatively safe enough and protected enough to actually create an industry in the way that we know now, and there's definitely pros and cons to that. And the other is a big category of ethical issues around oversight, power dynamics. I really appreciated what Alan said in his presentation yesterday around having preparation for thinking about ethical issues ahead of time. Imagine, that's really, really important and really, really helpful, because the reality is that these issues around ethics, around power dynamics, et cetera, do not go away when you take out the medical model. The power dynamic exists any time you have the transfer of medicine, any time you have any sort of facilitation happening. It's not just in medicine. So I'm going to really quickly go through 4 big questions, because they're ones that have been coming up in these local initiatives and efforts, and I think that we as a community really want to start thinking about and having ideas for, because when the local governments come up to you, if you're an advocate, and they're like, what happens when someone takes too many mushrooms in the streets and goes crazy? And you're like, well, I worked at the Zendo at Burning Man once. They don't really love that response. We really have to have something that's a little bit more robust, that's a little bit more scaled, that really shows that you know like what kind of issues might emerge and how to respond to those. So the first, how to handle manufacture, sale, and distribution. This is really hard. And as Carl said yesterday really brilliantly, if a personal possession isn't criminal, then everyone becomes a drug dealer. If there isn't a line of who's a drug dealer, who's not, then everyone becomes a drug dealer, and criminalization continues, and in some cases actually increases. Quality control is necessary to ensure safe supply. We can decriminalize all we want, but if there isn't a safe supply, then this issue of fentanyl poisoning, this issue of adulteration continues to happen, and then you actually don't solve the issue of access to a quality product, which is essential for safety. And then last, what's the difference between clipping a plant and extracting a molecule? This is a really, really big question that this is its own weekend workshop. I'm not going to go into it, but it really matters, because in some cases, in some of these efforts, you're seeing like the molecules being decriminalized, which means you can extract. In some cases, it's just the plants. In some cases, it's the molecules, but not the plants. In some cases, it's the plants, but not the molecules. So it's just kind of hard to tell like what exactly we're decriminalizing, what we're changing as we move these forward. How do we ensure that facilitation services provide high-quality care to a full spectrum demographic of people without relying on philanthropy at scale? There was a whole panel about that. That was really interesting. I hope you all saw it. I'm not going to go into it, but that is a really big question, because facilitation services, again, do not only happen in medicine. Anytime we have collaborative work, anytime you have a circular process going on, there is some sort of facilitation, there is some sort of power dynamic that exists, some sort of awareness that needs to be built in. How do we navigate relationships with local communities, the people that we're actually trying to do the decrim on behalf of, that we're trying to do this work for, facilitators and practitioners, the people who would be carrying out this work, the government, whether it's the state or local government or the federal government, and law enforcement. And on this question around law enforcement, how do we fund and train law enforcement in nonviolent crisis response? How do we fund and train social workers, therapists, or mediators as first responders? And how do we fund and train community education, mutual aid, and risk reduction? All of which is going to be necessary if you want to do psychedelic decrim and not rely on law enforcement, people with firearms, to enforce the laws when people do inevitably extend out of the safe container that they're intended to be in. So someone put it really well the other day, like decriminalization only goes like part of the way, because if you decriminalize and don't think about these larger social services, these larger needs, then you're kind of setting yourself up for failure, in the sense that I do believe that this community is wise enough, strong enough, resilient enough to bring this forward in a way that minimizes the risk and harm to other people. And nothing's perfect, we can't predict the future, and things can go wrong, and it's really better to be prepared and to work with the people who have the infrastructure as much as it's hard for even me to say this, it's really important to work with the people, including law enforcement and social workers, that have the infrastructure to do this kind of care and work with that process as we also break the processes down at the same time. So ultimately, my question is, can the momentum to decriminalize psychedelics be used as leverage for meaningful funding and support for public mental health infrastructure? Can we use psychedelics as a Trojan horse? Everyone's really excited about psychedelics. It's so cool. Psychedelics are awesome. What happens when people are really excited about psychedelics and then they forget that most people that are experiencing mental health crisis are not on a psychedelic? Most people that are on the streets in San Francisco are not on psychedelics. Most of the people that are having these issues are not on psychedelics. And even if they are, they deserve the care just as much. So it's critical to remember that as we think about these efforts, if you think about this full spectrum thing that's much bigger than the psychedelics, if psychedelics can be one sliver of a larger push, of a larger conversation on mental health crisis response, then we can use this momentum in a way that puts money, that puts resources, that puts infrastructure to do that care that happens to also be really good for psychedelics. That's amazing. We are stewards of this space. Please pay attention to the tension between the urgency of need and quality of care. This tension has come up repeatedly. It's really hard because when you're saying everyone's depressed or everyone knows someone that's depressed, it's really easy to say we got to go as fast as we can and do anything we can to get access to care. People have been dying for these reasons for a long time, and from those deaths of despair that are rapidly impacting especially white middle-class Americans, I want to add things like environmental racism, police brutality, gun violence, other things that in fact non-white Americans that are also part of these despair deaths, also part of this narrative that is causing early death for a huge amount of people in the United States that's not being addressed by psychedelics or anything else. Identify and embody your role. Activism and implementation require different commitments and compromises. A lot of people really want to be activists and get the laws passed. That's the first step. It's really awesome. Implementation is a multi-year process. It's very slow, and it requires you to negotiate with people you might not agree with a lot. It's not fun. It's very difficult. It can be very challenging, but it is the work, and it is what we're doing if we're building an infrastructure that actually is meaningful to a large group of people. And lastly, remember that the work does not end with decriminalization. Full spectrum social transformation also requires standing in solidarity with indigenous sovereignty, climate justice, and basic human rights, including healthcare and housing. And I'm going to say that again in caps. Full spectrum social transformation requires standing in solidarity with indigenous sovereignty, climate justice, and basic human rights, including healthcare and housing. If we don't have those things, if we don't have those things, then we're actually missing the point. We get access to the drug, that's really nice. We get access to a chemical that can do a lot of amazing things. But I'm glad and I hope sincerely from the bottom of my heart that you have the resources, that you have the care and container that you need to do that work. But if we are not working to ensure that that container exists for other people, then we are totally missing the point. And sometimes it's really hard. If you go too fast, if you don't pay attention to these things, it's really easy to forget that the criminal law, that the government are not the only rules here. There are cosmic laws, there are old ways, there are original instructions, there are things that help the world operate as they do, that are based in the land, that are based in the stars, that are based in the way that our hearts work, that must also be made aware of, that must also be brought into this process. And remember, spirit first, heart second, the rest comes next. I think that's it. Thank you so much. If you want to check out that document, check out maps.org/policy-reform. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm currently starting up the Penn Society for Psychedelic Science, a student group at Penn, and one of our focus areas is community engagement and psychedelic equity. And how do we as students move forward with policy reform, with sensible drug policies? Mm-hmm. So we actually just became a SSDP chapter just last week.
Shout out SSDP.
So we're really excited to join the SSDP family. So my question for you is, how do we work more with MAPS?
This is a little bit of a buzzkill answer, but I'm going to be honest. I think the best thing that people that are interested in, especially that with the angle that you're describing around really focusing on equity and building relationship between different communities, is to look at efforts that are adjacent or sometimes not even within drug policy, but that intersect with the issue of trauma. So the thing about psychedelics is that, and especially the work that we do at MAPS and a lot of the medicalization work, is that psychedelics to me are kind of this big, wonderful, rainbow, glittery bridge that you enter to get to the shadow, because that's the work is it's nice to have the visuals, it's nice to have the experience, euphoria, all those benefits that Carl was talking about, awesome. But part of what makes psychedelics so special is that they allow you to enter the shadow and do trauma work. So the reason I bring that up is because the big intersection between the work that we do, trauma healing work, and larger social movements is that a lot of systemic issues that are being challenged by social movements, like issues around migration, around housing, around access to safe injection sites, a lot of that comes down to trauma. You heard in the last talk that Swoon gave around this intersection of trauma and addiction. So I would actually say, like, start by building relationships with people that are likely experiencing or that have like that deep kind of trauma built into the way that these movements and systems are working. And then just start figuring out like how you as like an SSDP group or you as a person who's trying to do drug policy reform can help with people who are like dealing with issues at the border, like issues that seem outside of our issue. And I know some people really want to focus, and I recognize the value of that, but I really believe that we're like kind of past that phase where we can just be single issue people. It's really like too late for that. And I think that the first step is building these relationships with these other people and organizations, and then figuring out what comes out of that. Like, I would love to see what policy recommendations come out of collaborations like that.
My organization, Magic, helped run the digital campaigns for Decriminalize Denver, and we had a lot of stakeholders weighing in on the messaging because we were running all these Facebook ads to help get the word out about the vote. And so I'm curious if MAPS has any guidelines of do's and don'ts about messaging when you're promoting or wanting to get the word out about these various campaigns in different states.
We have a really general do's and don'ts in that document, the policy reform document, that are worth checking out, but we haven't gone super deep into it because we're still kind of figuring out like what makes sense. There's a couple things that we were very clear on, though, that kind of started coming up in some of the local kind of efforts around decriminalizing psilocybin, especially, or deprioritizing psilocybin, and that is the like this idea, and Carl really spoke to this yesterday, of like this drug exceptionalism, like, well, at least we're not like helping people shoot up. You know, there's a lot of, I notice in a lot of drug policy messaging, there's a lot of like hierarchy creation, where it's like mushrooms are like, it's like not heroin, so it's like fine, or it's like not this, so it's fine. And I think that actually ultimately really harms the movement. I think it's actually not helpful to do that exceptionalism. Although it might be better for voting, it's actually bad as a whole. And anything that further marginalizes people that are already marginalized, including people who inject drugs, is actually like the opposite direction that I want to see. So I would say in general, like really thinking about that in a really holistic way, and like figuring out how to do that precise messaging without necessarily throwing others under the bus. That's one. And I think the other really just has to do with kind of seeing a longer picture. I think one of the big lessons from the cannabis reform movement was not to fight for laws that you'd have to undo later. And I feel like there was a lot of excitement and movement around trying new things with cannabis, and I think that's good because it allowed for a lot of experimentation. We're going to see that also with psychedelics for sure, and that's a good thing. And I think that I would, especially with messaging, I would just be really wary of like, it's one thing to get like a voter to vote yes on something. It's another for like the chief of police to say yes to like being remotely willing to engage with this at the city council level or whatever. So I think the fact that this messaging really needs to be tailored both to like the audience, and it's easier with Facebook when you have like targeted ads that you're going for, but also like thinking of it like how would it look like if you, and this is hard to predict, but I think if you're aware ahead of time that multiple stakeholders will eventually be looking at that issue, it's really good to think of that like in a full spectrum way. So check out the document, and let's talk more, because I'm really thinking about how to do messaging, and I've been getting Facebook ads in Oakland a lot for like ayahuasca and psilohuasca retreats and stuff, like starting like when they deprioritized it 2 months ago, and I'm really thinking about how we do this online thing, because I'm really afraid of like the online like marketing machine being applied to psychedelics. It's too targeted for me.